Hello, everyone. Today, I'd like to talk to you about The Old Curiosity Shop by Charles Dickens. This was written 1840 to 1841, and it is Charles Dickens' fourth book, surprisingly. So, obviously, Pickwick Papers, Oliver Twist, and then in Lightning Time, he managed to write The Adventures of Nicholas Nickleby, and at the same time, he was obviously writing and slightly later publishing of The Old Curiosity Shop. So, to jump straight into it, no ados about this. This book, in many ways, is a failure. It's a failure in terms of plot. It's based upon, it's all held together very bizarrely by coincidences that are very hard to believe. You've got so that the way that they find Little Nell and the grandfather in the end is that one of the nice folk, the Garlands or the granddad's father, I can't remember which, happens to have a relative who's living in Tong in Shropshire, who happens to mention that he ran across a pretty girl and a grandfather on the road, and that they're living in the church. Otherwise, they wouldn't have been found. It's a massive coincidence. And then we've got the coincidence that Brass Sampson felt the need to write down his instructions from Quilp and put them in a safe, and then the coincidence that the mysterious woman living down in the cellar found another key and was able to break into the safe and retrieve this evidence. Unbelievable coincidences. Kind of like, and then there's a coincidence that the schoolmaster, Mr. Morton, haps upon the two a game on the road just when Nell collapses, and he's able to take Nell to an inn and to pay money for a doctor. So, even by Victorian standards, this is quite hard to suspend our disbelief about the plot of this book. And then, more fundamentally, we have the failure of the people in this book. They can't save Nell. There's the failure of medicine in this book. This is a failure of medicine continually. It doesn't offer a salve or a cure. Nobody can cure Nell. And it seems that nobody can cure the old man of his gambling as well. And, any week of the year you could probably flick through the Daily Mail and read of miracle drugs to prevent us getting dementia, to cure us from cancer. Where are these drugs? I've never met anybody who's been treated with them and been saved. It's a failure. It's a failure. And then we obviously have the failure involved with the grandfather's gambling. His idea of how to save him and Nell is a massive failure. And it's such a stupid idea to gamble what little you have, when little you have is possibly enough to eke out an existence. They have the shop already. They have the goods in the shop. If they work the shop a little bit harder, advertise properly, then perhaps with all the goodwill of the local community, they could make a go of it, or they could maybe rent out some room. There's possibilities. This idea was a failure. The failure of people in Victorian Britain and modern present day Britain to really take seriously gambling and how it destroys lives. Nowadays in this country, more people die from gambling than they do from heroin. It's a failure of society altogether in this book. And then we have the failure of Dickens, the writer. He just got his planning all wrong for this book, really. He starts off the first three chapters in the first person, thinking he's going to sort of have two stories running concurrently, novels with lots of short stories, and they're all going to be told by this sort of grandfather figure next to a clock. But he realised he ditched that idea by the fourth chapter. That's Dickens printing his failure there. And then we have the failure noticed by lots of critics, not all, but lots of critics, about the sentimentality of this book and the characters in this book. Oscar Wilde famously saying that you'd have to have a heart of stone, not to dissolve into tears of laughter when you read about little Nell's death. You've got Algernon Swinburne, who says that little Nell, just doesn't have any of the normal feelings or guilt or worries, and none of the blemishes that make humanity, and therefore she's a monster. And then you obviously have some other famous incidents of an Irish politician who read the book, final chapter of the book, and then threw it out of a window in the train. Failure. And then, as lots of people have rightly pointed out, and I owe my example to a below-the-line bloke, and I don't know, Goodreads or something like that, the failure of the prose in many points in this novel. And this is the one that the commenter mentioned, and I think it's a good example. Oh, it is hard to take to heart the lesson that such deaths will teach, but let no man reject it, for it is one that all must learn, and is a mighty universal truth. When death strikes down the innocent and young, for every fragile form from which he lets the panting spirit free, 100 virtues rise, in shapes of mercy, charity, and love, to walk the world and bless it. Of every tear that sorrowing mortals shed on such green graves, some good is born, some gentler nature comes. In the destroyer's steps there spring up bright creations that defy his power, and his dark path becomes a way of light to heaven. This is not what this book is telling us at all. The universal truth is not that a child's death matters and that produces future acts of goodness. What was Nell's death for? Absolutely nothing. She didn't really save her grandfather in any meaningful way. He manages to struggle on for a few weeks and then dies. A broken man who's he's lost his wits. It's just strewn with disaster. This book encapsulates so many people in awful conditions, and it seems that their pain and suffering and eventual death isn't going to produce any universal truth or goodness. It's a failure. It's a complete lie. And then, so failure. Now, this might be a short video of under 10 minutes, but don't butt me no buts. But should be the middle word in life. But is like a miracle, really. It's the counterpoise that there is a lot of good in this novel, and you'd be a fool, or you'd be a very poor reader, not to notice it. So let's try and take it one by one. The failure of the plot, the coincidence. There's no getting away from that. I think that is a failure. But it's the world that Dickens paints that is a success. It's a massive canvas. It's in the picturesque tradition of landscapes unfolding as the hero goes through this landscape and meets characters and learns things along the way and has adventures. And it's a mighty, mighty canvas. So it starts in London and then the Midlands and eventually ends up in Shropshire, a town called Tong, I think. Takes in fairs, travelling folk, takes in America, the grandfather's brother, who is also not named. That's a bit strange. He makes his money in America and then comes back. Yes, he's a failure for not coming back sooner, and the grandfather's a failure for not mentioning that he needs his brother's help. So we've got commerce, and then we've got Australia, where Kit is nearly sent to. So this is the empire, and this is the totality that Dickens is trying to show us, and it's grim, and people say it's not realistic because it's full of grotesques and strange folk, and how could this really be the mimetic art at its best? But I kind of think that that's how it is, and some ways how it still is outside of London. When Nell and the grandfather are fleeing, you soon move from important buildings and streets and civility and the rest of it to shacks, basically sheds, dotted around poorly cultivated agricultural land, and poverty hits almost immediately, and then they get taken up by they fall in with a Punch and Judy pair, Codlin and Shorters, and then we reveal to this world of gypsies and travelling folk, and this just strange itinerant life. And then get to Birmingham, where they're on their last legs, they can't find anywhere to stay, and they come across this bloke in a doorway, and he recognises their plight immediately, and he says, "I've got somewhere for you to stay," and then they get taken to this mill, and he tells his story of how he was born there, and when he got old enough, he started working the furnaces, feeding the coal into the furnace, and he just stares at the furnace, and he gets sort of narrative from the furnace. It's like he's he's reading the furnace. We see this also in Our Mutual Friend, where they look at the fire, Paul and his sister, and they get something from it. So that's just complete fantasy, and it's surrounded by, at night time, you can imagine it, all the smelting, all this gold bubbling, gold coloured melting metal and the rest of it. It is William Blake's satanic mills, and it's nightmarish, and he's trapped there, and he's got no thought of leaving there. And I must say at this point that all these public school boys, and the last day of the proms, where they sing Jerusalem, and they proudly sing the words satanic mills, there's nobody thinking that, we shouldn't really be proud of these satanic mills. It's like this is where thousands of people died and were maimed and crippled by these mills. This is the cost of our supposed wonderful industrial revolution, and it was a massive human cost. And why should you celebrate something that was so awful? Apart from a few exceptional philanthropists at the time who realised the inhumanity of this, everybody thought, whoopee, great, we're headed full steam ahead. Just don't tell me about these poor suckers that are living in satanic mills. In fact, turn it into a song, we'll all sing about it, and that'll make it better for everyone. So yes, and then the dissection of British life is kind of fascinating. You've got entrapment. Imprisonment becomes an important theme here, like in Little Dorrit, but it's less in the foreground. You've got the Marchioness, or the woman who lives downstairs from in the lawyer's basement. That's Samson Brass and Sally Brass, who are horrible characters who only have one client, and that's the evil Daniel Quilp, who probably is the father of this young girl that's living down in a cellar where she's locked in every night. Sally Brass comes down every night to make sure the fire's out, and to lock her in and feed her on this very meagre rations. This is kind of Oliver Twist food. This is she's imprisoned there without wages, and she's illegitimate. So this is modern slavery with a bizarre sexual twist, and it's obscene and grotesque if you consider for a moment. Wow, that's startling. You've got to be quite a brave writer to put that in, and I think it's quite convincingly portrayed. And then another example of slavery is that Niddle Nell and the grandfather, they're fleeing Quilp, and they come across Mrs. Jarley and her waxworks. She's another travelling person, with Georgia helper, and she's a kind and wonderful person. And they settle in Warwick, where she's going to set up her waxworks and charge people to see the waxworks. And she's thinking that little Nell, it's a very cute girl, just a beautiful, beautiful child of innocence and honesty and all the things I see from day to day. And they want to get this girls' school. They want to get the pupils and the staff from the girls' school to go to the Waxwork Museum. It'll be good money for them. But there's one poor soul in this school who is in prison, like the H&S. It's basically another form of slavery. This young lady, being motherless and poor, was apprenticed at the school, taught for nothing, teaching others what she learnt for nothing, boarded for nothing, lodged for nothing, and set down and rated as something immeasurably less than nothing by all the dwellers in the house. The servant maids felt her inferiority, for they were better treated, free to come and go, and regarded their station with much more respect. The teachers were infinitely superior, for they had paid to go to school in their time, and were paid now. The pupils cared little for a companion who had no grand stories to tell about home, no friends to come with post-horses and be received in all humility with cake and wine by the governess, no deferential servant to attend and bear her home for the holidays, nothing genteel to talk about, and nothing to display. She's nothing. She's trapped in a job where she's hated, and because she couldn't pay for education, she becomes a slave to that educational establishment. Wow. And then, of course, you've got the metaphoric imprisonment of the grandfather being imprisoned in his obsession that he can make money from gambling to secure a better future for little Nell, and it's just so far from reality, and it's nobody can knock him out of this illusion until right at the end, when he realizes, it takes the realization that his granddaughter and the only thing he loves in life is going to die before he can see beyond his own stupidity, and then he owns up and says, well, actually, I stopped gambling a long time ago to improve your fortune, Nell. I did it just because I couldn't stop myself. And, having to face up to why you do something, maybe you can get beyond it. But yes, is that redemption? I don't think that's the universal truth, spouting footsteps of goodness everywhere at all, but that's some type of relief from imprisonment. But Thingral for universal truth to me. Yeah, just trapped. Daniel Quilp's wife is trapped in an abusive relationship. She seems to love him, but he tortures her and her mother, and does everything he can to upset her, basically. And then, of course, she's instrumental at his death in the end. And you've got Richard Swiveller. He's kind of, his life is a baffler. He's trapped probably by his own stupidity. Everything baffles him, and he's a willing pawn for Daniel Quilp, who sets him up with the lawyers. And his redemption is that he shows his niceness. He's kind to everybody. He's just a bit stupid and aristocratic. She saves him after he gets beaten up, and life becomes less of a baffler by this act of kindness from the person he's been kind to, and he kind of escapes his imprisonment because suddenly he inherits money. Sometimes you just need a miracle, don't you? You just need a miracle. No miracle for now. So that's looking at, the counterpose to the plot being a failure and coincidence is that we're given these vignettes, these little descriptions of what life was like at the time, and it's fascinating, and that's far from a failure. That in itself is enough to keep you reading on. And right, let's carry. Critics, how they call the Old Curiosity Shop a failure. I love Oscar Wilde, and I'd be first to defend him if somebody was to criticise him. But he's being tongue-in-cheek because, clearly that quote, it's at the end, would dissolve in tears of laughter. He's waiting for the final punchline. But anybody with a brief knowledge of Oscar Wilde would know that you're being a hypocrite, mate, because you wrote The Little Prince about a statue with jewellery and about a little sparrow that stays with the statue even though it should be migrating to warmer climes, to give the jewellery from The Little Prince to all the poor in the city. And when the statue is finally taken down and melted down, it's a broken heart is found. A broken heart is found in the statue. Now, if that isn't designed to make you cry, I don't know what is really. So, Oscar, look to your own house before casting aspersions at the greats that came before you, or came at a similar time as you. And Algernon and Swinburne, you kind of got it a little bit wrong about children. I find they're not the same as adults. Their consciences are calibrated differently, and it's perfectly possible for a child to be very virtuous and kind and tell the truth. I'm sure the instinct is, when we're born, to tell the truth. We are kind of born in innocence. Don't kind of believe in the Garden of Eden, but what happens to children when they hit puberty is that it becomes a lot more grey. Black and white becomes grey, and yet morality becomes a stranger and grainier experience. But I don't know why Algernon's got a problem with this wonderful little girl. I live with a 10-year-old who's wonderful, and her instincts are to tell the truth and to be kind to her classmates and to her family. So yeah, you got that wrong, I believe. And okay, this book is supposedly a failure. So why was it then that when the last instalment was published in Britain, people flocked to the piers in New York to scream to the sailors, "Is Nell still alive?" This book was read, and read too, I presume, by thousands of people. This was a nail-biter. Everybody wanted to know what happened in the end. This book was a huge commercial success for Charles Dickens and cemented his career as a very important writer. You could probably write anything after this book and people would buy it because people loved it, and people still today love sentiment and the rest of it. Look at EastEnders, that's not high art, but there's always calamities and tragedies and tears and deaths and stuff going on. People love it, and damn the critics. Perhaps the people know best sometimes. So and if you can't see the goodness in this book and rate it as important, then I think you, the reader, have failed in some ways. Maybe you've been blinded by, the high aesthetics given to you by your education, or to people whom you respect. Sometimes it's just a good story, and obviously there's more to it than just a good story. But look to yourself, reader. This is not a failure. In fact, I would go so far to say, if I'm the only person who's going to defend this book, I say this is my favourite book, and I would take this to a desert island. Absolutely, because I want to be the one that stands up and say, this is not a terrible book. And it's my favourite. It's my favourite. I would give 90% of the books produced by fated by the Man Booker Prize. You throw them all out. I've swapped them all in a blink of an eyelid for one more Dickens book. Yeah. So, it's very relative, really, isn't it? Very relative. So, and yes, prose. So, this awful prose. On the next page, so I read to you the one about the great universal truths, and on the following page, I swear to you, just here we have another very different passage. If there be any who have never known the blank that follows death, and weary void, the sense of desolation that will come upon the strongest minds when something familiar and beloved is missed at every turn, the connection between inanimate and senseless things and the object of recollection, where every household god becomes a monument and every room a grave. If there be any who have not known this and proved it by their own experience, they can never faintly guess how for many days the old man pined and moped away the time, and wandered here and there as seeking something, and had no comfort. In my own personal experience, I know this writing to be a reflection of what it's like to suffer grief. You do. Somebody died in this room where I'm speaking. Somebody very dear to me. And this room it's a grave for me in some ways. We live with the dead and with the recollections, and all we can do is try and wall it up in a part of our brain and don't let it take over. And sadly for the grandfather, he couldn't. He just lost his wits after old Nell had died. It's truly tragic, and this writing is truly good to bring this out. We are, I know, as flies to wanton boys are we to the gods. They kill us for their sport. Just sort of, yeah, it's just beyond our control. Some have good lives and others just die far too young, and it doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason. You could be with one of the nicest people in the world, and it doesn't give you an extra minute. And the living have to continue living, but obviously not for very long for the grandfather, so the quote was from King Lear, Gloucester, but the grandfather is kind of like King Lear. He's, instead of losing his daughter, he's lost his granddaughter, and yes, he's a broken man, and he sits on the grave all day, and children come to him, but he's not there. He's already in the next world. There is no next world. Indeed, churches in this book. Little Nell and the grandfather come across quite early in the book. Shorters, his Punch and Judy folk, and Codlin, and they're repairing their Punch and Judys in a graveyard, which seems quite a strange image. And they say they have to hide away from the public and repair in secret to maintain the delusion. All right, so it's in a church where you can hide things, and indeed, yes, you bury people far away from the town. Is just the church where Nell and grandfather end up is kind of like a little bit away from the village, and it's just a lonely, isolated place, and where the two end up living. It's not very good habitation at all. It's sort of crumbling down, and the church is described as dark and quite foreboding. It's not a place of good cheer, and you don't see crowds of parishioners coming on the Sunday, gaining the word that's going to improve their morals and thus improve the world. It's another illusion, and I don't know whether Dickens intended this, but this is kind of what I've got from the church references in this book. So the sexton is nice, the people of the church kind of like have a wisdom, but it's, as an institution, it kind of fails to help all these poor people that we meet upon the way in Nell and grandfather's journey. They can't offer enough succour or enough help, basically, and a lot of charities today kind of feel the same way. And so, before I move on from the bit about the prose, just a 3-word phrase. He spent quite a bit of time talking about nature, and he talks about tight sticking snails. That's just brilliant alliteration and imagination to describe snails as thus. And yes, the page before, there's some brilliant nature writing. So yes, for every poor bit of prose in this book, there's a lot of brilliant prose, and you don't lose it, do you? You can have a poor game as a footballer, but you're still kind of a genius footballer. Messi can still do it, and right from the beginning, Dickens clearly can do it and does do it in spades. And then there's this brilliant bit where we're still on the bit of the Punch and Judy men. So after the meeting in the church, the Punch and Judy men invite Nell and her grandfather to stay the night at an inn where they can get some free food and lodging, because there's a fair happening, and obviously big money for the inn, so they can show a little bit of generosity. And they're talking to Shorten is talking to Mr. Vuffin, who works at the inn. How's the giant? Said Short. Rather weak upon his legs, returned Mr. Vuffin. I begin to be afraid he's going at the knees. That's a bad lookout, said Short. What becomes of old giants? Said Short, turning to him again after a little reflection. Oh, they're usually kept in caravans to wait upon the dwarfs, said Mr. Vuffin. The maintaining of 'em must come expensive when they can't be shown, eh? Remarked Short, eyeing him doubtfully. It's better that than letting 'em go upon the parish or about the streets, said Mr. Vuffin. Once make a giant common, and giants will never draw again. Look at wooden legs. If there be only one man with a wooden leg, what a property he'd be. So he would, observed the landlord, and Short both together. That's very true. Indeed of which, pursued Mr. Vuffin, if you was to advertise Shakespeare played entirely by wooden legs, it's my belief you wouldn't draw a sixpence. This is brilliant comedy. The bizarre conversations that people had in those times and still have today, often with the benefit sometimes of mind enhancing chemicals. But so you're saying, what happens to the old giants then? What do you do with them? Well, we have to hide them away, because if the public see them, then they're not going to see them for free. They're not going to pay us to see them, and that somebody with a wooden leg is only interesting or valuable if there's only one of them. And Shakespeare wouldn't, Shakespeare performed all on wooden legs, wouldn't interest anybody because there's just so many wooden legs. This is just a brilliant conversation, taking the bizarre and pushing it to its logical conclusion. And this is kind of Dickens being brilliant. I don't know whether intentionally or unintentionally. He's talking about economics, isn't he? Scarcity drives price. Yeah, and he leaves it to us. He's not going to make a comment, Dickens, about the bizarreness of this economic system that everybody falls in line with. But you're clearly not taking into the account the fact that they are giants and they have feelings and they are humans, and nobody ever asked the giants what they want to do, what jobs they want to do, and whether they want to be, held in isolation once their legs go. This is the cruelty of economics that Dickens, with brilliant satire, and comedy, manages to point out. So this is genius comedy writing. So now, that's the critics. I've already said, Wilde is a little bit far from the mark, and it's probably tongue in the cheek of his criticism of this book. Quite interesting that in the Wikipedia page, the stir caused by the final instalment of the Old Curiosity Shop can only be compared, in one commentator's thoughts, to the stir created by the last instalment of Harry Potter and the Deathly Hollow, whatever it was. That's hilarious, isn't it? So, J.K. Rowling, I'm sure if you asked her in all sincerity, would you rather have written all these Harry Potter books or just this one book? And she'd probably say this, because this... We'll forget J.K. in 100 years' time. These things won't even be in charity shops. I don't suppose we'll even have charity shops by then. We'll just all sort of have numbers and live in some sort of amortic fluid until we're needed. It's ridiculous. If you're going to fate very minor and unimportant and alive writers, and then slate a recognised genius who's buried in Poets' Corner, you've got to get your calibration correct there. That's not right. Critics, it's a flawed work of genius. Let's put it that way. This is a glorious failure. And a massive hit. The public don't really care that you don't like this. They loved it at the time, and there's been lots of movies of it. and it's been very successful. Um, Other things worth mentioning? Well, there's a lot. Of course, you could spend a long time talking about Daniel Quilp. He's another fascinating evil character that, on the one hand, maybe seems a bit one-dimensional in his evilness, but then again, um, like Fagin, he's cast out by the world. He's a hunchback. He's a dwarf. People call him names. He's learnt to fight for himself. And he's got quite an acerbic wit that is quite enjoyable. He kind of deflates people at points. And he seems to have some sort of bizarre charm. He has a hold over his wife and a hold over Tom Scott, his servant. And it's a great comic scenes that he's involved in, particularly when he moves to his warehouse, is fed up with his wife, and he sets up in his hammock, and Brass Sampson comes to see him. He locks the door on him and then forces him to drink scalding hot gin and water. And he locks all the windows and he smokes away, so the atmosphere is thick with smoke, and he's burning. He's burning Sampson's throat. He's like a devil torturing a soul that deserves to be tortured, and that's kind of how everybody's tortured by him. And as I said before, it's a failure of society to manage to deal with this man, because even when the good characters finally get the evidence to get him arrested, they don't catch him. It's just that he flees, and unfortunately he's got so much money, there you go, that yes, he drowns with his pockets loaded with gold and coin, and it's absolutely fascinating. So the Marchioness, who's locked up downstairs, I find her brilliant as well. All the travelling folk, very interesting, and how they go about things, how they think about things, is very interesting. The portrayal of religion, all of this. It's a bleak world where they can't really offer very much other than their continued existence to bury people. It seems. Dear. Yes, dearie dear. I think I'm going to finish there. Now, this is... Where do you finish? I should also mention that it's a little bit odd that it's called the Old Curiosity Shop, because we don't really have many descriptions of this shop, and the contents are taken away quite quickly, and the main characters leave the shop. And I think he might have wanted to change the title if he hadn't serialized it and thus committed himself to it in an early age. Yes, it is kind of... It tells a lot about our times, that we kind of feel good about ourselves for running down this book. We should look to where we are now, really. Yes. So, yeah, failures. I see this government as massively failing, and their butt is not a real butt. Their butt, which is the vaccination program, and we were the first. We're doing it so well. I think mine is a real butt. Mine is a real butt. Theirs is a fake one. So I hope you enjoyed listening to this. Sorry if it sounded all a bit crazy and like a rant. It's a very personal book for me. Very strong portrayal of grief and the innocence of childhood, and what happens to a child when it's cast upon the world, and really how does it find the resources to deal with the cruel world that it's in. And yes, the result is no, it doesn't. The child dies. On that grim note, bye-bye.